Welcome, everyone, to the Revenue Cycle Truth Podcast. My name is Josh Fearley, and our goal on this podcast, as always, is to share engaging revenue cycle insights and content from some of the leading experts. So today, I'm really happy because we're joined with Kyle Boudreau. Kyle is the Revenue Cycle Denial Manager for a 1,700-bed hospital system, and prior to that, he was an operations lead for a very large consulting house. So I've really enjoyed listening to Kevin's perspective in the past on denials and some of the things he does in terms of workflow, templates, and looking at trends. So we're really happy to have you here, Kyle. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Appreciate you being on. So maybe we'll start, because denials is something that I'm really always, intellectually curious about. It's very interesting, but let's start just maybe from a trend perspective, from a high level, and then we can kind of drill into some of the things you're doing from a detailed level. But what maybe are you starting to see, and you can go in any direction you want, but in terms of trends from payers and denials, what things, maybe understanding how well you're doing, concern you the most kind of in the future here, take it any direction you want?
Yeah, I think something that will resonate with a lot of systems is we continue to see issues with clinical denials, inpatient lengths of stay, not meeting medical necessity, and really the payers becoming more and more strict on that, and really being strict on those clinical guidelines. So that's something that we really see, every single month is a high volume amount of clinical denials. And I think some of the other big areas that we really see are, some of those services that are kind of difficult and very expensive as well, like cancer. Cancer is, a big one that the payers are really going to test you on to make sure that you are following those clinical guidelines that are set out by those associations, and making sure that you have all of the upfront processes, finalized before you submit the bill. So you make sure that you did the authorization appropriately and included all of the drugs, or make sure that you included all pieces of radiation. And, if authorization maybe wasn't required for something, did you do a predetermination to ensure that, what you're going to bill is covered based on the diagnoses that are going to end up going on the claim? Another kind of big one is, making sure you have your auth process in place in general across the system. I think some systems may be lucky where they have some medical necessity clauses in place, but when you get to the point that you have to appeal based on that, that's really challenging. So I think just making sure that front end processes are aligned to the back end as well.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, this is why I like talking to Kyle. This is the stuff that I'm interested in. What do you think just in terms of clinical denials? And yeah, we see the same thing in regards to oncology and things like that. But just in terms of clinical denials, why do you think there's more denials today? What's just your personal opinion about that? And then maybe after that we can kind of talk about some of the workflow things you're doing and things along that line. Just curious.
I think really part of it is documentation. You see a lot of claims that have unspecified diagnoses, and I think the payers see that and they want proof that the reason that you admitted the patient, even though you're billing with an unspecified diagnosis, truly meets that medical necessity. So I think that's a big part of really a lot of those short stays. So like your 0 to 3 length of stay, was that really medically necessary? And I think the payers are really just trying to test you to prove that that is the case. I think maybe from like a longer stay perspective, you run into a couple other issues where maybe, the end of a stay wasn't approved or finalized. So you kind of run into, maybe you have a difficult patient demographic. So in your market, maybe you have a lot of Medicaid that has maybe some social barriers that are preventing you from being able to discharge that patient. We see, quite a few cases of that, being in a metropolitan area, that can be pretty difficult.
Yeah, excellent. Very well said. And then in terms of, we've exchanged some notes on this in the past, but I'd really like to hear from you though. In terms of what you're doing, you've had some great ideas and great strategies in terms of workflow templates, things like that. Can you maybe kind of shed some light on those strategies as well?
Yeah, so I can use this clinical area as an example. So anything that maybe is more of an administrative denial or function, whether you didn't get the correct payer on the front end or you didn't obtain the auth at all or timely on the front end, that's something that you should really look at from a contract perspective. So maybe you have a medical necessity clause built into a contract, or the provider manual has some language in it that allows you to appeal based on medical necessity, even though you didn't do that administrative function. So for the payers, some of the things that we've looked at is building out templates by payer to actually, copy and paste that contract language exactly in it, and making sure that, we have an understanding on the back end of at least what clinical guidelines mean. So going back to the notes and reviewing their clinical criteria that they put in, and if they checked all of the boxes off on their MCG or interqual criteria, then this patient actually met an inpatient length of stay. So we're actually reviewing that before we send out that standard appeal for those payers to make sure that maybe we making sure that we shouldn't do something else like a downgrade rebill or something of that sort. Just trying to really accelerate and bring in as much cash as possible, being the focus there.
Yeah, very good point. Very, very good point. In terms of is there anything exciting you're maybe seeing or understanding in terms of kind of technology to help facilitate some of these processes or workflows or data analytics? I'm just curious. Maybe it's heavy process, like you said, heavy CEI, heavy documentation and workflow. But are you starting to see any technology or hearing about technology? I hear a lot about process automation, AI. I'm just wondering what your perspective as somebody who works in a very large hospital system and deals with this continually, what you're kind of seeing.
Yeah, I think there are definitely opportunities, depending on, what system you're on, people that are on Epic. I think Epic has a little bit better functionality because all of the modules are really kind of in one place, and they more or less speak well together. So I think, if you're an Epic user, you may already have some automation in place, and you can really kind of optimize on that. So for example, if you submitted an appeal 30 days ago, and now you want it to go to kind of like a more, higher level person, like a coding appeal specialist, you could automate that in a work queue based off of, account activity. I think in, some systems that maybe have some older technology, I've seen some opportunities in, in different tech companies that can really help you optimize on workflows, and they're kind of more bolt-on technologies. But I think from a reporting perspective, that's something that I think organizations really need to focus on and consistently think about. For example, in a lot of the work I see, we are going back to reason remark codes and recategorizing them in ways that really help us root cause better. So if it is a denial, for documentation and making sure that clinicals were sent up front, well, then let's call that a denial in our reporting. So making sure that you're always going back. There might be some informational type denials that have a very specific remark code that you'd want to map to a different category, whether that's in your system or outside of your system, and maybe like a SQL query. At least that information is available to put in like a scorecard or like a Tableau dashboard.
Yeah, great point. And I have seen, I'm curious what you think about this, but contracts are kind of the lifeblood of hospitals, and they obviously impact denials. And some contracts can have some very difficult, I guess, language in it. what are any processes or what are any things you're doing to kind of, first, is that relevant? And then what are any processes or auditing that you're doing to look at the contractuals and really understand the contractuals and its impact on denials? Because I'm sure I always kind of go back to the contracts, because in essence, if you're pretty confident about your contracts, then and you can kind of prove it with the data, then you're kind of in a good spot. You still may have to argue it, but I'm just curious your perspective.
Yeah, a lot of the times that we really need to include our contracting, our provider relations entity is typically from a denial. Honestly, it takes typically a little bit of an account being worked. Maybe you have a rep that's on the phone with a representative at the payer, kind of telling you something that doesn't really make sense. Maybe it's something like processing a claim at, if it's an out-of-state plan, it's processed at the local, and then, that's how it should be adjudicated. And, you might get some sort of weird response from the payer saying, oh, this should go to the home plan, but the home plan isn't requesting it. And I think when you kind of catch those payers saying things that just kind of, raise a red flag, I think those are moments that you really need to think about what that means and involve those individuals that are really responsible for maintaining the contracts and the relationship with those payers. Really bringing that to like a JOC meeting or your provider relations meeting, and just having that dialogue, because there might be some sort of claim system issue on their end that they aren't aware of, but they need to investigate. So I think maintaining that open dialogue with the payers and really diving deep into the work that your reps are doing on the back end would really help from an overturn perspective.
Sure, great point. And then from what's your take? I've noticed a lot in clinical appeals that some of the best clinical appeals are unique. They're kind of very engaging. They don't necessarily have to be very long, but they have to be very descriptive. We've seen a lot of good trends personally, being able to really kind of detail out a good clinical appeal, and often, our nurses or our managers are working on them. I'm just curious what your perspective is on clinical appeals, given that you kind of said you're seeing a rise in these. And I would imagine that one of the ways to offset this is to have an engaging, appeal that kind of lays it out very well. So just curious, any thoughts you have along those lines?
Yeah, I think it's important to spell it out as simply for the payer as possible. I think they really want you to see that you validated that patient's medical record next to what the clinical guidelines are. So even if that's saying, lab values worsened from this date to this date, and calling that out directly in the body of the letter, making sure that you're including your clinical rationale for why you admitted this patient or did this type of service directly in the body of the letter, and then you can reference the documentation for further details. But I think you really need to pull out the specifics from those guidelines and call them out. Otherwise, you might get to that point where they deny it again, they uphold the denial. And if you have the ability to do a second level appeal, your second level appeal probably really isn't going to be that much different from the first one anyways. So making sure that you really call that out and making sure that you have all of the appropriate and necessary details up front in that body of the letter, I think is really, really the key to success in a clinical appeal.
Yeah, very well said. Okay, last question here, and we'll get going. But I'm curious, in regards to I kind of lost my train of thought there. You kind of made a very good point. In regards to the actual, the remits and their impact on denials or any other types of data points that you're seeing, is there areas, are you, what's just your take on that in general? And, how does that, we've noticed that remits can obviously shed some light on a denial and they can help with a denial. But in some cases, it's difficult to sometimes get certain data points that are interesting. I'm just curious if you have any points around that.
Yeah, just getting, the adequate necessary information off of a remit, typically from like a root cause perspective, isn't the greatest, and it does take some review to really get down deeper into what the true root cause was. So if you got a 197 denial on an inpatient claim for authorization, that might mean level of care, or it might mean you never notified the payer, and without reviewing the chart, you might not know that. And so some of the things I've seen is there are opportunities from a reporting perspective to improve on that. So if you're an Epic user, there are reporting code functions in your denial record, and you could customize those specific to the need of your organization. So if your department is reviewing a 197 denial on an inpatient claim, you could have a reporting code that says, something along the lines of notification to payer missed. And that'll get you down to that next level of detail that you really need from a root cause perspective. And that's already likely part of a workflow if that's something you implemented in your work to be able to report and improve how accounts go to different areas. So it might not really be that much of a change from like a workload perspective anyways to implement something like that.
Yeah. Okay. I thought, very, very well said. I thought of my final question here. So, revenue is going to be super important. And you don't have to get too much in the weeds on this, but obviously I think revenue is going to be critical now for hospitals, just given everything that's going on. What are some strategies and some thoughts around how to ensure revenue when you're dealing with denials or cash flow and things like that? So just any thoughts you may have.
Yeah, I think, in a difficult time, it's important to really look at your inventory. What's out there that's high dollar, what's out there that's aged, what's out there that's been appealed, and it's been a while since you've heard back from the payer, and really targeting and focusing on your areas of opportunity in your AR, and really kind of pushing on the payers. I know that this is a difficult time for the payers as well. They might be having increased volumes in other areas, but really being able to target, if you had an appeal that was out there for 30, 45 days, and the turnaround time for a payer is supposed to be 30 days, call that out when you're on the phone with the payer and say, well, you're supposed to process this appeal within 30 days. Where are we at? Can we expedite this for processing? Just really kind of, identifying how you can, push the payer to get that processed quickly. Just kind of focusing on, big key areas that that you may have opportunity to get that big revenue in the door.
Yeah, great point, Kyle. Well, thank you for joining us here. Really appreciated all your feedback, and thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you again for